We turn to Moscow now, where Chinese President Xi Jinping and Russian President Vladimir Putin are meeting for a high-stakes summit. It's Xi's first visit to Moscow since Putin launched his brutal war on Ukraine. The two leaders were very complimentary of each other and signaled a deepening strategic partnership. The U.S. and Canada are highly critical of Xi's trip to Moscow.
That President Xi is traveling to Russia days after the International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant for President Putin suggests that China feels no responsibility to hold the Kremlin accountable for the atrocities committed in Ukraine, and instead of even condemning them, it would rather provide diplomatic cover for Russia to continue to commit those very crimes.
China and China's leadership needs to understand the stakes here and needs to understand that Vladimir Putin is on the wrong side of history. Countries that choose to support Russia are supporting war criminals and a war crime.
Ian Bremmer is president and founder of the Eurasia Group and G0 Media. He is in New York. Mr. Bremmer, good to talk to you again.
Good to be with you.
So just weeks before the war, Xi and Putin described the relationship between Russia and China as a no-limits friendship. And now 13 months into this war, the two leaders are talking about deepening their strategic partnership. So how should we interpret this meeting?
Pretty badly. This is probably the worst week I've seen for U.S. and Canadian geopolitics in years. You just ran the clips. The Americans, the Canadians are deeply unhappy about the Chinese president spending 3 days in a state visit with Putin. This is very different from back in September, the last time these two men met at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit in Samarkand in Central Asia, when Putin was a little sheepish, when he had to say publicly that he recognized that China expressed concerns about the war in Ukraine. None of that is happening right now. No, this meeting comes on the back of Xi Jinping making unprecedented criticism directly of the United States, something he's not done in his 10 years of power. And the very fact that it comes on the back of the ICC's announcement that Putin should be arrested for war crimes, and it is a little hypocritical that, of course, the U.S. Secretary of State is calling that out since the Americans refused to recognize the ICC. But leaving that aside, it's also Putin going to Mariupol, where many of those war crimes were committed, literally hours before Xi Jinping shows up. So it's very clear whose side of the equation the Chinese are on here.
You know, Secretary of State Blinken, who you mentioned, he suggested that China's so-called peace plan for the war is nothing more than a stalling tactic. What would they be stalling for? Stalling for what?
Well, there is a belief that this war over time will go more in Putin's favor, in the sense that the Americans are increasingly politically divided about how much support they should be giving to the Ukrainians. The 2024 election cycle, of course, a big part of that. So too, Trump as the Republican leading candidate for the nomination. And given that he is suggesting that the U.S. should stop providing this support for Ukraine, I mean, all of that, of course, redounds to the benefit of the Russians. I do think the Chinese are interested in allowing that to play out, but the Chinese are also interested in calling for a ceasefire, in calling for negotiations, which President Putin is prepared to accept, in part because he knows that President Zelensky and NATO cannot and will not accept it. And that's a big problem because, of course, it's not just the Chinese that would like to see a ceasefire. Frankly, it's almost the entire developing world, this so-called 12-point peace plan that the Chinese have put forward. If you didn't know the Chinese wrote it, it could have come from Mexico, could have come from Brazil, could have come from India, could have come from pretty much any of the developing countries in the world. And the Americans and the Canadians and NATO, they forget, given the extraordinary alignment, how many countries in the world do not see this war through their lens.
Right, so just help me there understand from your perspective, what are China's strategic goals in terms of Russia's war in Ukraine and going there and doing this and prolonging it? Like, what's the long-term play here for Xi?
Well, number one, they don't want the Russians to lose. It's the fact that as the U.S. and China relationship gets worse, the Chinese do see Putin as an important strategic partner, and they want to make sure that he continues to be able to function internationally, and that means not just as a rogue state, from the perspective of the U.S. and Europe, but that Putin is able to engage with other countries around the world. And China showing up in Moscow normalizes Putin for so many countries that are continuing to do business with him. It provides a lot of cover. This is the second largest economy in the world. It's the second most powerful country in the world. So it really sends a very significant rejoinder to the Americans and the Europeans who have argued as if they're speaking for the world over the course of the last year of this brutal invasion.
You know, when we see pictures of a Western leader sitting down with President Zelensky, the way we saw President Xi sitting down with Vladimir Putin today, there's usually military aid, humanitarian aid, financial aid coming behind it. The U.S. has warned of the possibility of military aid from China to Russia. Do you think we're inching towards that? Does this meeting accelerate that possibility?
It certainly makes it more plausible. Let's keep in mind, part of the reason that Xi Jinping publicly criticized the United States is because the U.S. had intelligence that Chinese state organizations were starting to coordinate military aid for Russia. They were making that plan. And the Americans, instead of just discussing that with the Chinese privately, decided that they were going to make that known publicly in coordination with NATO leadership and the UK. And the Chinese did not like that. They felt like this was the same way the Americans treat the Russians, where they have intelligence on something they don't like, for example, the upcoming invasion of Ukraine, and they decided to call the Russians out on it. Does that make it more likely they provide military support? Well, I have two quick responses to that. The first is the Chinese do not want to be on the wrong side of American economic sanctions. That's why they haven't broken those sanctions to date. I would personally be quite surprised if the Chinese were to directly provide military support for Russia. But it's very clear the Americans and NATO do both believe this, that the Chinese are still trying to find ways to covertly provide that aid. If they think they can get away with it, they will. And that, of course, is the fact that there's zero trust in this relationship, the fact that the Chinese are considering acting in ways that would effectively make this a proxy war between the U.S., NATO, and China, that's a pretty dangerous position to be in.
Where do you think this goes next? I mean, I think it's a loaded question to ask, I guess, but what comes next in this after Xi leaves Moscow?
You're right. It is a loaded question. It was going to be an unloaded question until today's announcement that the Europeans have found another 1 million rounds of ammunition that they're able to provide the Ukrainians. I use that play on words advisedly. The fact is that Ukrainians were going to have a really hard time with their counteroffensive against Russia unless they got that artillery. That artillery is now coming. So first, where this is going is the Ukrainians, who presently have about 13% of their territory occupied illegally by Russia, are going to try to take some of that territory back as much as they can, probably starting in April or May. They'll see how it goes. The Russians have a lot more troops to fight with. They're not as well trained. They're not as well equipped. They don't have as good intelligence. That'll play out over the next few months. Obviously, the more land that the Ukrainians are able to take back, the more likely it is that Ukraine would be willing to then say, okay, we can talk about negotiations, we can talk about a ceasefire. To the extent the counteroffensive fails, it becomes much harder for President Zelensky to do that. The other question is, West, do you still have the same level of commitment and support? Is it as unified? How about the Americans? How do we look at the debt limit crisis? If the Americans can't pay for their own bills at home, will they still be willing to spend $100 billion on the Ukrainians? These things are all enormously relevant for Russia's staying power on the ground in Ukraine, as well as how the Ukrainians are responding to Western pressure.
Okay, Ian Bremmer, always appreciate the insight. Thank you so much. That's Ian Bremmer, the president and founder of Eurasia Group.
Good to see you.